science, travel, but also the beauty of Jewish culture. The Messianic Jewish community in North America is more similar to the North American Jewish community than to the general U.S. population. We're Jews. It's a very simple point, but it's proven by the data that Jewish believers are very much Jewish in the way they think, their orientation, their association with our civilization. Disposition, education, occupation, it's very much in line with and overrepresented in the Jewish community. Nomenclature preference and religious observance levels among Messianic Jews indicate an identification with the Jewish people. So I asked them, what do you want to be called? And the vast majority said Jewish believers, Messianic Jews. So being Jewish was very important to them. Intermarriage, having one Jewish parent, attendance at a church rather than a Messianic congregation did not appear to decrease Jewish identity or Jewish practice. So that's really important. It doesn't mean that our Messianic congregations aren't vitally important, and they are, of course. Okay, it doesn't mean that Jews for Jesus offering what it offers to Jewish believers isn't vitally important. Giving opportunities for Jewish believers to do things that are Jewish, worship in a Jewish place, and have congregations and camping and every expression of Jewishness. We want Jewish believers to marry Jewish believers. All of those things within the Messianic movement we think are important, but this is interesting as well. Jewish believers who even don't marry Jews, who are even immersed in the culture and immersed in church, still want to be Jewish. The need for critical thinking in the area of intermarriage. This could be a profound problem in the next generation and in the next generation. Because if it continues at this level, in a couple of generations, will Jewish believers still be Jewish? And that's an important thing to think about. As we talk about reaching Jewish people, is our material relevant to the group receiving the message rather than those bringing it? So often, our material is based on what we're comfortable with as opposed to the comfort level of those we're trying to reach. We develop our materials with people who are receiving them in mind, not with us in mind. And that orientation is often forgotten. Are we talking to Jews? Quite often, we talk to one another about the Jewish people as opposed to talking to Jewish people. So you've got to talk to Jews. You have to interact with Jewish people. You need to have those hard conversations with Jewish people. You need to interact with people who do not share your worldview or who disagree with you. Do you have the courage to face that kind of opposition? Do you have the courage to face people who are overeducated, more sophisticated than you are maybe? Do you have the courage to do that and still present the hope and the faith that you have in Yeshua? You have to have that courage. Do you have the ability to communicate with regard to a more sophisticated culture group? Jews are overeducated. We have more world experience. Jewish people have passports at a higher level than the general community. So Jews get their passports, they travel, they experience the world, they are educated, they're a more sophisticated culture group. If they're more experienced and cultured and experienced, if they're more sophisticated than you are, do you have the courage to talk to them? You should, you must. Think about the increasing influence of churches and Messianic congregations. The data shows that Jews who are spiritually hungry find themselves in Messianic congregations and in mainline churches. Jewish believers who come to know Yeshua will go to churches where they have friends, family, co-workers. They like the teaching, they like the preaching. Jewish believers, the majority of them are in mainline churches. Most of them are independent, charismatic, large churches that have good programs. So I'm ordained, I'm credentialed in the Christian and Missionary Alliance. But in many ways, I did that because I like the alliance. It's oriented towards the world and world evangelism, and they're interested in Jewish people. But I used to be the rabbi of a Messianic congregation in South Africa. So I find myself in all different places in the body of Messiah. Jews who hear and respond to the gospel need to be taken seriously, and you need to take their feelings into account as to what they need. Are you willing to exercise critical judgment regarding material and methods and projects in your interest in bringing the gospel to Jews? Does something work? Can you measure it? If it doesn't work, why use it? If nobody cares, if Jews are not hearing, if they're not responding, why bother? If it makes you happy, okay. But if you're trying to reach other Jewish people, it has to appeal to those people, not to you. The orientation needs to be outside, not inside. So I know that you called me David Barron. This was written by David Barron. David Barron was a scholar in Britain in the 19th century, a Jew who came to trust in Messiah. What we continually press upon Jews is that we believe Jesus is the Son of Man and the Son of God, not in spite of, but because we're Jews. We believe that Jesus is the King of our people, the sum and substance of our Scripture, the fulfiller of our law and prophets, the embodiment of the promises of our covenant. Our testimony is that of Jews to Jews. That is just an incredibly well-written paragraph. And the fact that he was able to write that in 1893, and that he had the courage to do that in an anti-Semitic environment, it's just very profound and very popular. But I couldn't say it better than that. That is what we are all about. Now, if you're having trouble sleeping, you can download my thesis. I think it's about 85,000 words. It's on the University of Toronto T-Space, which is the public website where all the doctoral dissertations are found. So if you're having trouble sleeping, that'll do the job for you. And then if you'd like these slides, just let me know, or they're already here, so you can feel free to share the slides. They're copyrighted to me, but as long as you want to share them, just say they're from Andrew from Jews for Jesus. Questions? Sorry?
Oh yeah, that's included in your material?
Including me too?
Is this paragraph included in your material that you have available through internet?
I don't understand your question.
That paragraph
included in the material.
What material?
your thesis?
Yeah, it's on this. It's there. It's on the slide.
Yeah. I'm just asking if that is included in your thesis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because this is very good wording.
Yeah, it's very well written. It's just like I'm so jealous of that paragraph. I just can't believe that I can't write like that. So I'm just like I just had to put it in there because just to inspire me, because it's just such a well written paragraph. But he was a very gifted man. He wrote commentaries on Daniel and Isaiah, which are just amazing commentaries. Any other questions?
So you sort of aligned with what you said about having courage. What questions have you, or do you suggest to ask that you need courage for when speaking to Jewish people?
Well, when you talk to Jewish people, you need to first be a really, really good listener and try to understand where these people are coming from. Good communication is mostly listening and not mostly talking. And then when you find out what the perceived need is or the perceived interest, then you have to be able to address it. But for the most part, sharing what God has done for you, sharing your own story, your own testimony is always a good thing to do because it's what you know best. And also giving Jewish people the scriptures. So what we like to do in Jews for Jesus is give away the Gospel of John. Because it's easy, it's simple, it's short, and it shows Jesus very powerfully as the Word, as the door, as the shepherd, as the way, as the truth. They're just very powerful images of Jesus. And getting Jewish people to read the scriptures for themselves is a very powerful thing. and then having a working knowledge of the Scriptures and being able to answer questions. So that's what takes courage, and being able to say, I don't know. Say, I'll look it up and I'll get back to you.
Thanks.
Do the Reformation people like Luther, Dr. Martin Luther, did they have a big impact then and having a big impact even still today?
No, I mean, most Jewish people don't see Luther as a friend. So even though at most of Luther's life, he was a friend of the Jews, but at the end of his life, he was enraged by the unbelief of Jewish people. But I don't think that Luther is useful at this, it's useful intellectually, but not as an evangelistic tool. I don't think so, no. But he wrote a lot of good things for Jewish people earlier on in his life. But he doesn't have a good reputation.
You were talking about your first time in a church and how strange it was for you. I'm not sure if you have the answer from speaking with these people, but in their experiences, going through churches, maybe even just for yourself, finding yourself in there and seeing everything that is so strange, did this offend you and make you want to walk away from it, or is it something that made you so curious that you needed to dig more into it?
Well, remember, what I was saying is that the people of Jesus were offended me, not the person of Jesus. So I couldn't understand the expression of who he was, in its institutional form, was bizarre. Not who he was, not his words, not the words on the page. So I was able to overcome that, and I still do it. I still overcome it, because the body of Christ is a strange place, if you think about it. What we do and what we're about, our expressions of faith in him, for me, as somebody who looks at things critically, are sometimes bizarre, and that includes me. So you try to move away from all that and just focus on who he was and what he was about, because the institution is always going to let you down. But he won't. So I was able to overcome that by focusing on the person of Yeshua and who he was and whether or not he was the Messiah, and knowing the frailty of human institutions.
So you were basically interested in who he was apart from the institution.
Right. Yeah. It's not an excuse for the church to behave badly, but we still do. But because the way we represent him, the institutions that we build are bound to fall short. And we have to realize that. We can't constantly make excuses for ourselves, and that's why we need to point to Yeshua on the cross. That's what it's all about.
I was just going to ask a question. I'm sorry about that. It seems that the way the hymn you were talking about was talking about blood and washing in blood and stuff like that, and that has a huge negative connotation with Jews. So would you use anything to do with blood other than how would you approach that event?
I wouldn't. I think the issue of blood sacrifice and atonement is not relevant to most Jewish people. Jews see Judaism as important, but they don't want to observe it or participate in it, and they would see the sacrificial system as something that's represented, something that's old and passed away.
I understand, but I'm asking that as the question.
It's not. I don't think it's something that you can. It's a theological question.
I mean, speaking as somebody who can respond to that the blood sacrifice is repulsive to me. I don't want to hear it, and yet I know it's important for me to accept it, if you like. But it's always been, the blood issue is a major one.
Well, it's a theological point. Yeah.
Given that life is life,
These are theological points that don't necessarily help, or that may be a distraction. For me, and however you find yourself, the issue is Jesus the Messiah? Is he the one that Moses and the prophets spoke about? And how can I come to him? And how can I have my sins forgiven, past, present, and future? Can is what Jesus did on the cross about me? I mean, that's what this is about. It's about focusing in on the person and the work of Yeshua.
You began this morning by talking about your existential sense of attachment or aloneness. When approaching the arguably intellectually superior Jewish person, how much of the argument needs to be on an emotional level and how much needs to be somewhat intellectual?
It really depends who you're talking to. I mean, I don't think I could make a general statement about that. I think most Jewish people are overrepresented educationally, and so you need to be able to pack the ammunition that you have. If whatever ammunition you have available, you should be able to use, even if you may not be as sophisticated or as educated. And sometimes it's just the supernatural faith of a child, or the healing, or a prayer of healing, a prayer of comfort. The work of the Spirit, obviously, is what this is about. So Jews come to know the Lord because of the work of the Spirit, not because we're so smart. You had a question here. This one here.
In your data from 1983, you show that 6% of your Jewish people that were surveyed said that there was a supernatural experience that was involved.
Right.
But in your data in 2013, that category wasn't even there.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it wasn't there, but that's a good point. I think it could have been overlooked, but I don't recall.
Are you saying that God is no longer in the mix there?
Oh, well, come on.
Because it was so blatantly not there.
It just could have been a word that wasn't used, and so there was a sense in which people were responding online versus responding, in a different format in 1983. So the question has never been asked, but people were just assuming that the Spirit was at work. So I can't answer the question. I can't answer the question about how the Spirit works.
Know about why. I just want to know why it wasn't there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's just that it didn't show up in the data.
Since the greatest gain seemed to likely be with young people, and you were mentioning downstairs as well, the culture of young people seems to be changing, or our society generally seems to be changing. Do you feel like there's ways that in evangelism work, particularly with young people, we should be addressing that cultural shift or taking their
I think we need to let young people talk to young people. So in our camping programs, the people who run those programs are younger. And so we need to be able to trust them, to disciple, to mentor, to encourage, to pray, and let the next generation start leading. Because they don't want to listen to people like me. They want to listen to people like themselves, who are younger, who are respected, and I think that is proven to be something that is working well. What's the key? I don't know. It's obviously the work of the Spirit, and we're seeing more Jews hearing and responding, but we're just not seeing breakthrough. So less than 1% of Jews believe in Yeshua. Less than 1%, probably closer to 1/2 of 1%. So that's an incredibly small number. But we would say it's a significant minority. So it's still an incredible amount of unbelief. Among 16.5 million Jewish people, you have maybe 70, 80,000 who are Jewish believers. So that's very small. So we have to be real about that. We have to be real about the hardening and the failure, and the irrelevance that we find ourselves in. One more?
I was going to ask, can you give us a comparative rate of Jewish people in North America and Israel believing or coming to know Christ?
Well, the number of Jews coming to know the Lord in Israel is much more significant than in North America. So there are no, when there are younger people there. So the number of young Israelis coming to know the Lord, staying with the Lord, discipling, and staying in the faith is higher than in North America. But I don't have those statistics. Okay, and those statistics are very hard to come by. So I'm trying to bring my research to Israel, but it's very, very difficult work to do. But what I do know is Israel is our largest work. It's our most substantial work. And there are more Jews hearing and responding to the gospel in Israel than in North America. Okay, so I just need to take one more question because I have another appointment. So this is the last one.
Yeah, I just want to point that there's the anti-missionaries, Jews for Judaism.
Yeah?
And they're really working hard.
Well, Jews for Judaism headquarters is in Toronto. So they work hard as well, but they're more interested in intermarriage and in secularism, and they're also interested in the lack of Jews who actually participate in Judaism, even if they're married to Jews or have Jewish parents. They also do anti-missionary activities, but their bigger problem is lack of interest in Judaism. So Jews who believe in Jesus are more interested in Jewish things than Jews who don't. Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you. So many of you heard that I was confronted with the gospel in university. Somebody gave me a Gideon's Bible, and I gave it to a friend of mine, and she gave it back to me, and I started talking to her. And then, for some strange reason, she thought that it would be a good idea to invite me to church. And for some strange reason, I said yes. I don't know why I said yes, but I did. And so I walked into this church with her, and it was the strangest thing I had ever done. It was the strangest place I had ever been to. Nothing really made any sense to me. The art, the architecture, the music, the way people dressed. The first thing that I noticed is that in church, people sat from the back to the front. And in the synagogue that I grew up in, we sat from the front to the back. Now, that was weird, and I was asking questions of people that brought me, and they didn't really understand why I didn't understand what was going on. But I just felt like that is where I belonged, and I was determined to try to understand what these Jesus people were all about. But then, the first... Sorry?
I think the mic is disconnected right now.
The mic? I can hear the mic. Oh, okay. So, the first hymn started. There's a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins. And I thought to myself, like, what is going on? Like, in synagogue, I knew who Emmanuel was. It was the tent of David. It was the kingship of David. It was the throne of David. That was Emmanuel, God with us. That the throne of David would never disappear. So I'm thinking to myself, why is David bleeding? And I asked my friend, I said, who is Emmanuel and why is he bleeding? And people were going, shh, 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 shh. And I said, why, you can't talk here? Because in synagogue, you talked, all the time. That's what you did. There were different things going on and people moving around, getting up, moving and talking. And I was a very social environment. And I didn't realize that in church, that's not what you did. You sat and you watched what was going on at the platform. There was only one thing going on at a time. I didn't understand that. But my friend said, Emmanuel is the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And I burst out laughing. And I said, that is the stupidest thing I had ever heard. How could Emmanuel be Jesus Christ? And I was incredulous. Nothing about the people of Jesus made any sense to me. I was drawn to Jesus through the New Testament, but the expression of the people who had faith in him and what they were about, what they believed, what they looked like, what they talked about, how they worshiped, and the church, the people of Jesus, the people who said they believed in him, that made no sense to me at all, because it wasn't Jewish. So you fast forward quite a number of years, many years of experience serving with Jews for Jesus, getting my master's in anthropology, and then deciding to do doctoral work at the University of Toronto. I wanted to understand this a little bit better. What was it that drew Jewish people to cross over these incredible social and cultural boundaries? Because the thing is that when people come to trust in the Messiah, they don't want to have to do that. They don't want to have to cross over these social and cultural boundaries, but we force them to. And I wanted to understand how that happens and what that pattern was. I'm the kind of person that looks for patterns. Because when you see patterns, when you see that data, then you have information to make a decision. You can't just make characterizations. So that's what I did. This was a doctoral thesis that I completed. It took me 7 years to do. It's a big fancy title, but basically I tried to survey a lot of Jewish believers in Jesus, and I tried to understand what their experiences were like. And I tried to feed that into a computer, and that computer gave me information. And I presented that information in a doctoral thesis. So I did the majority of this survey leading up to the dissertation in 2013 and 14, and I asked questions covering age, background, education, religious observance, vocation, experiences. Now this is more information than you really need, but I had almost 1,600 responses. Now, how did I get so many? Well, I begged a lot of people. And through the infrastructure of Jews for Jesus, we have a lot of contacts with Jewish believers. Through the infrastructure of the different Messianic platforms like the Messianic Times, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, the Messianic Jewish Alliance, a lot of friends, people who knew people, Jewish believers who knew Jewish believers, people who had computers who didn't have computers. It took me a long time because I felt like getting as much data as possible would be most useful. And then I dug down and I took 50 of those people to get even more information, and then I dug down even deeper with 25. But the majority of the data that I'm going to show you is only a very small portion of the dissertation, is about those 1,600 Jewish believers in Jesus. So what I tried to do was this: take that statistic and compare it with other surveys that were done about Jewish people. So 30 years previously, Jews for Jesus had done a similar survey. So I had that data, and I was able to compare it with my data. But also, fortunately for me, the Pew survey, the Pew Report on American Jews, came out at the very same time. So I was very fortunate. So if you're familiar with Pew, they are a multi-million-dollar organization that is very, very powerful and uses very powerful computers and metrics. So I was able to have that data as well and ask the same sorts of questions. So basically, Jews who come to trust in Yeshua have heard about him, for the most part, in some way that they understand by the time they're 25, which is very similar to the Gentile church at large, is that people who come to know Jesus generally come to know him before they're 25. After university, after people get married, they go off on their careers, their attitudes get more cemented, and their beliefs get more cemented. And the gospel tends to have a harder time penetrating that hardness. So most Jewish people hear the gospel by the time they're 25. Most hear the gospel median-wise, the majority, the average Jew who comes to know Yeshua hears the gospel when they're 17, responds in faith when they're 22. That's just the average. Okay? The results show a consensus that reflects this very interesting commitment to Jewish character, culture, and continuity. Respondents try to maintain a connection to Jewish culture and the wider culture. So Jews who believe in Jesus are in the communities that they find themselves in, and they participate in secular culture and Jewish culture at the same time. 25% occasionally attend local synagogues outside the Messianic Jewish community. And that's because these are Jewish people who go to synagogue with their families. So many of them will participate in the life of the Jewish community outside the Messianic Jewish community. A wide-ranging Jewish disposition. 90% of Jewish believers have an association with Jewish tradition, observe some Jewish practice and lifestyle rituals, and mark some festivals. 90%. So you can see, this is my study. So 10% of Jewish believers never celebrate the holidays. In 1983, it was 22%. So today, more Jews who believe in Jesus are celebrating Jewish festivals than ever before. 90% are. The Pew study, 22% never. So Jewish believers who celebrate the festivals are more likely to celebrate the festivals than non-believing Jewish people by 10%. So there's an increase from 83 to 2013. Statistically, an increase in the number of Jews who believe in Jesus who celebrate the holidays. Not just that there's more Jewish believers, but the percentage of Jewish believers who celebrate the holidays is increasing. So there's more of an interest and an association with things that are Jewish. We're not talking about how they do it, we're simply saying they do. I wasn't interested in how. I just wanted to know if they had an interest. The most common way that respondents heard the gospel was through personal conversation. Jews hear the gospel in the marketplace, through friends, co-workers, classmates, relatives, peers. If you know a Jew who believes in Jesus, you ask them where they first heard the gospel, the vast majority of them will say that, in the marketplace. Friends, family, co-workers, classmates, peers. Smallest, online or social media. Now we expect that that will increase. So I'm hoping that in 5 or 6 years I can do the survey over again and compare the results. Most Jews who hear the gospel, they read the Bible, specifically the New Testament, after they hear the gospel and they want to know, okay, what is going on? Where's the information? Now, intermarriage is an interesting issue in the Jewish believing community. So, in the Jewish believers are intermarrying at the rate of 76%. Okay? The net Jewish means all Jews across North America, 44%. Okay? Reform, about 50%. Jews of no denomination, 70%. In 1983, Jewish believers at 74%. So for the past 30 years, Jewish believers have been intermarrying at this rate, 76%. The good news in this is that I divided, in my research, I asked them if they had married someone who wasn't Jewish, and based on age group. So what I found is that the older Jewish believers who are in their 50s and 60s, it was around 77, 78%. But among younger people, between the ages of 18 and 30, it was closer to 50%. So why do you think that is? Jewish believers who are younger have more opportunities to meet other Jewish believers than they did 30 or 40 years ago.
Because of the babies. When they're old, they don't have babies.
No, you don't understand. Jewish believers now have more opportunities to meet other young Jewish believers than they did 30 or 40 years ago. Why is that? No.
Easier to move around.
There's more availability. Well, where is that availability come? How, if you're a Jewish believer and you want to get married to a Jewish believer 30 or 40 years ago, how did you meet them? Church? Where are you going to find a Jew in a church? But today, if you're a young Jewish believer between 18 and 25, and you want to meet a Jewish believer, how can you do that? It's not just social media, it's the camping programs. So it's the Alliance and the Union, it's the trips to Israel, it's all the camping programs that all the congregations and the ministries have been employing have starting to pay off. And so my children, through the Jews for Jesus camping programs and trips to Israel, almost all of their Jewish believing friends their age are Jewish believers, some men, some women. So you have much more opportunity for young Jewish believers to meet other young Jewish believers, where in my generation it was next to impossible. I married a Jewish believer because she fell on my head. I was just fortunate in that way. Okay? So I also asked, who is the most influential book or author? So have you guys heard of the late great Planet Earth? So that was a very, very popular book in the 60s and in the 70s. Hal Lindsey. Many Jewish believers were very influenced by Hal Lindsey, but you can see in my data, people who are under 50 didn't see him at all. So in the 1980s, Hal Lindsey fell off the map, but the one author who was consistently popular was C.S. Lewis. So I did postdoctoral research on C.S. Lewis and the Jewish people, and if you're available on Monday night, I'm bringing this research to Trinity Western University. So Monday night, 7 o'clock, if you want to go, I'm doing a whole presentation on C.S. Lewis and the Jewish people. But all that being said, there's a huge number and diversity of ways that Jews read things about Yeshua. But for the most part, it's C.S. Lewis. Case for Christ Left Behind. Evidence that demands a verdict. Betrayed. Have you heard of Betrayed? Stan Chelchin. So there are some authors that are much more profoundly being used by God. So if you have a Jewish friend who's open to the gospel, I would give them Mere Christianity. I would give them the Screwtape Letters. I would give them something from C.S. Lewis. Respondents are overrepresented in education, credentials, and professional and specialized vocation. So you can see this yellow is Jewish believer. 66% of them are in management, science, business, and arts. Okay? But only 3% in maintenance, which means that we don't want to do the work. We want to be in charge. Okay? But this is very much in line with the U.S. population of Jewish people. Okay? Most Jewish people in North America are in management, science, business, and arts. Jews tend not to be in construction or maintenance. So Jewish believers are Jews. We are very much part of that educational subculture. I broke it down by education as well. So you can see that Jewish believers in 1983, 22% had a postgraduate degree. In 2013, 27%. But the Pew study of all Jews in North America is 28%. So we, just like most Jews, like going to graduate school. Okay, but bachelor's degrees, 35% compared to 30%. So more Jewish believers are in undergraduate programs, more Jewish believers are than the Jewish community at large. But here as well, very much overrepresented in high school, in So 42% of the general population, high school or less, with only 20%, 9%. So 91% of Jewish believers go past high school. So just like our Jewish brothers and sisters all over the world, we are overrepresented in going to graduate, postgraduate school, undergraduate school. It simply shows that Jewish believers in Jesus are very much part of the culture when it comes to our desire for education. Associations, memberships, giving, this basically showed levels of interest in all things Jewish. So whether it's being part of the Jewish Community Center, learning Hebrew, accessing Jewish media, going to Israel, supporting Israel, traveling to Israel, learning Hebrew, any number of things that Jewish people do to participate in the Jewish community, Jewish believers are overrepresented. For all age groups, some kind of participation actually increases after coming to faith. So I broke it down in the data by age group, by how do you participate, what do you participate in, and for the most part, every area of participation in the Jewish community increases after Jews come to faith in Yeshua. How did they hear the gospel? This is in 1983, 49% from individuals, 12% search for truth, 8% Bible. Supernatural intervention, 6%. But in 2013, as you would expect, it's much more diverse. Okay? So, but the vast majority here, conversation with friend or relative. But the interesting thing that I wasn't expecting is church. I just couldn't believe it when I saw it. That Jewish people are finding themselves in churches. Probably the way I did. They got invited. And also that's encouraging is Messianic congregations are increasing. Okay? But you can see obviously a much more diverse way that Jews are hearing and responding to the gospel. But for the most part, it's a friend, family, coworker, classmate, everyday interaction and conversation with people in the body of Messiah. So I was interested in this concept of hardening from Romans chapter 11. Patterns emerging in the experience of people who responded, pointing to an association with what I believe Paul calls the hardening of Israel. My research attempted to understanding hardening in a contemporary setting. So when you read Romans chapter 11 and Paul talks about hardening, a lot of people talk about this kind of as an eschatological thing where the church is on the center stage, Israel is off stage, and then at the end of the age, the hardening of Israel ends and Israel comes on the center stage. The church goes off the stage and somehow Israel takes central role in the plan of God. I was interested in hardening as a social thing, as a cultural thing, as an everyday thing, this sense of alienation. What is hardening? I asked people. They called it death. They called it loss. They called it apathy. They called it identity separation. This was what were Jewish people going through as they heard and responded to the gospel? They would simply type in their answers and the computer would find patterns and words that were similar, things that came up that were bunched together. And these were the concepts that came out. This was one of my favorite responses. When I was in the synagogue, I was a Christian. When I was in church, I was the Jew. So where did you belong? You're homeless. Hardening is seen in both directions. So Jews were hardened towards the church was hardened towards the Jews. Just become a Christian, give up on being Jewish. That was that sense of hardening that Jewish people felt. I asked them to characterize this, to reflect on that experience that they were having, that incredulity that I was experiencing I wanted to ask them, what was it like for you? What was going on? So I coded these things. I asked them what it would mean for relationships in the Jewish community. So infidelity to the Jewish community was a point of pressure, especially for people over 50. So why would it be more profound for people over 50? Who are those people's parents? Those were the people who experienced the war. And so that sense of alienation is much closer to these people who've experienced the war, the Depression, the Holocaust. So you can see these points of pressure, community and friends, were much more profound for the older group. These are people in their 50s and 60s, the 40s, the 30s. Younger people consistently don't have that kind of pressure because they're living in a world that's much more relaxed and open to other expressions, to much more tolerant. Society's changed very rapidly and coping with other ways of doing things, other understandings of faith, much more tolerant than in my parents' generation. Fear of disloyalty, conviction of sin. So it's always in people who are older, 50s and 60s, much more profound. But in the younger people, all of these issues of loyalty or changes in your path of life, cultural barriers, not as profound. So I asked people specific questions about their experiences. So these issues of social control, prestige, shame and guilt, hardening. So these systems of social control break down due to secular assimilation. So if you think about in your lives, if you wanted to do something that was contrary to your parents' wishes, did they have control over you? In our generation, maybe more. In the next generation, not so much. Okay, so these issues of social control come up. Okay? Most experience passive or emotional control. So in my group, 22 were disowned, 2 religious control, 3 lost job opportunities, 3 uninvited to family or community events, 5 psychological control. Things like, you cause us pain, you're hurting your grandparents, you'll not be able to marry a Jew, you are a Gentile. So this is the kind of control that people, Jewish believers, experienced. So I coded this on a graph so you can see here from 0 to 12 is the level of pressure or control that was exerted on these people. 0 is no control. 12 is an unimaginable, difficult amount of control, a tremendous amount of pressure. And this is age. So this is amount of control and age. And I asked people whether or not they felt that they were being controlled socially. But you can see across all age groups, it's fairly minimal. Like 2, 3, 4. So there's a sense of, yeah, people didn't appreciate it when I came to I wanted Yeshua, I thought about Yeshua, I got a little pushback, but it wasn't a big deal. Through all age groups. You know, these data up here, you know, were unusual situations. But you can see here is the general pattern, and you can see the lines here. Shame and guilt, but look at that. So you can see the lines, friends, family, community. As people got older, shame and guilt was much more profound. So the older generations experienced much more shame and guilt than the younger generations. This is the generation that's more closely associated with the Holocaust, with immigrant parents. So the sense of shame and guilt that they felt internally and externally, the older people was much more profound. Their sense of identity was called into question, much more profoundly. Among family, friends, and community, look at some of these experiences here. 9 out of 10 when it came to identity. Very profound. Younger person, somebody here, 2 people in their late 20s, early 30s. Now, this is outside of the norm, so you can see these lines represent the average. But you can see that amongst my respondents, there was a general sense of identity crisis. Who am I? Am I a Jew? Am I a Christian? Where do I belong? Where is my home? Prestige as well. This sense of honor in the community was affected by thinking of Yeshua and trusting in him. You can see some people, very profound, difficult experiences. But this was out of the norm. Most people between 2 and 6. But that's still a certain amount of unpleasantness. Right? Conclusions. Jewish believers are integrated socially, but still feel part of the Jewish culture. They engage with expressions of Jewish tradition, they're acculturated, they accommodate, which means they want to be part of the Jewish culture, but they also want to go and do something on Saturday. Or they want to go to church on Sunday. Or they want to go on vacation on Saturday. Or they want to go backpacking or driving. They want to be part of everyday culture, but they also want to be Jewish. So they want both. They find truth consistent and coherent with Scripture. They don't find that coherence in their culture. They feel like strangers. So they want both. We adapt both the coherence and the beauty of Scripture, but also a secular life where you can adapt and take all the beauty and the joy and the pleasantness of life in art, architecture, music,